You may have heard these lines from Lord Byron's poem. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. These romantic and vivid lines were inspired by King Sennacherib's invasion of Israel, as told in the Book of Kings of the Bible. These biblical references to the Assyrians made them important to 19th and 20th century collectors and to those who were eager to see the historical accuracy of the Bible proven. American, British, German, and French archaeologists started to dig with these purposes in mind, and they sent home some of the greatest masterpieces of Mesopotamian art. One of the greatest treasures of the British Museum is the set of reliefs which once adorned a palace in ancient Assyria, the greatest empire of its time in the first millennium BC. At its peak, the powerful empire dominated a huge swath of land from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf. It was centered in the northern part of Mesopotamia, where the modern states of Iraq and Syria now exist. In fact, the name Syria is a survival of the Assyrian period. The capital of Assyria in the 7th century BC was Nineveh, on the banks of the Tigris. Nineveh was the world's largest city then, according to the Bible. The reliefs we'll look at speak to us and say so much about the society which created them. They actually make us feel like we are there. The time of their creation was between circa 883 BC and 640 BC, which was during the Age of Empires, the first millennium BC. Assyrian kings built enormous palaces to demonstrate their power. Stone reliefs were carved in order to decorate the mud brick walls, but there was more to their purpose than decoration. These reliefs weren't just intended as beautiful, strictly decorative art. As with all ancient art, the magnificent stone carvings have a function, some of which is obscure to us without explanation. Perhaps the most important purpose was to show how powerful and mighty the king of Assyria was. He's shown as a divinity, as a figure connected to ancient ancestors and places, and he's shown doing heroic things in battle against humans and animals. He repels dangerous forces. These are things that we have seen before and will see again in many complex or state societies, from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to Mexico and beyond. I shall show you the thread that connects them all, which is rooted in the human need for power, certainty, and order. We now find the Assyrian palace reliefs spread around the world. There was a reason the Assyrian reliefs were eagerly collected by many museums in Europe and America. They connected Western people to their past. More specifically, they were important as biblical history. Many missionaries and clergy of the 19th century wanted to prove that the Bible told real history. To them, the artistic value of Assyrian art was often secondary, and it was only recognized by a few enlightened people early on. The reputation of the Assyrians as warlike and brutal came from the Bible. Their power influenced the biblical world. In fact, some believe that our conception of angels having wings comes directly from the winged genies you see here on Assyrian reliefs. These would have been seen by a wide assortment of people in the first millennium BC and had a huge impact on our visual history. They are not delicate or small, but rather strong supernaturals combining elements of bird and man. Some of the earliest collectors and excavators of Assyrian art set off to the Near East as missionaries. They were sent to the difficult and dangerous Orient, not yet Iraq, to find concrete evidence of this biblical past. Some missionaries and clergy believed that the reliefs were scripture written in stone. The stone images, extracted and sent to museums, were meant to reinforce belief in the Bible, just as a tide of secularization swept over the world in the age of Darwin. Origin of Species was published in 1859. While the stones didn't achieve that end of stronger faith, knowing more about Assyrians certainly helped people to understand the Bible and the culture of the ancient Near East, from which some of the world's major faiths sprang. Some of the individuals who made the trip to Assyria, the northern part of what is now Iraq, died there. One from America was the Reverend Lubdell, a doctor and a missionary who died at 28 of typhoid while he was trying to procure some Assyrian reliefs for Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. So the road to acquisition of art is sometimes paved with tragedy. The British Museum was lucky to have the recovered works thanks to the services of the famed excavator Sir Austen Henry Layard. Layard had spectacularly successful results when he started digging at Nimrud, the earlier Assyrian capital, in 1845. He later excavated at Nineveh, and his 1849 book, Nineveh and Its Remains, was a bestseller, as were his later books. His work uncovered and provided the British Museum with some of its greatest treasures from the ancient world. In fact, some say that his discoveries of the heavily bearded Assyrian man started the Victorian fashion for beards. His marriage at 52 to a woman half his age inspired the creation of a necklace of ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seals as her wedding present. Apparently, Queen Victoria admired it when they dined with her in 1873. Continued excavations under Layard's successor, Hormuzd Rassam, produced even more exciting results for the museum. In the North Palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, he found the panels of the royal lion hunt, the most heralded and admired set of reliefs from the Assyrian Empire. Let's take a look at the art. So, who were the Assyrians? What was their connection to what came before in Mesopotamia? The Assyrians were a Semitic-speaking people who had come to power in the 2nd millennium BC in northern Mesopotamia. They had a distinctive art, style, and a warlike spirit. We know them as the Old Assyrians in the beginning of the 2nd millennium, the Middle Assyrians in the middle and later of the same millennium. The 1st millennium Assyrians are often called Neo-Assyrian. The name Assyria is a variation derived from the main god of Assyria, Ashur, who had his own city of the same name. As they rose to prominence in the 1st millennium, Assyrian power grew and their art reached a pinnacle of magnificence. It was sophisticated and skilled, yet it expressed many of the same themes we've seen in earlier art in Mesopotamia and indeed other parts of the ancient world. Earlier, we looked at a stela from the kingdom of Akkad, the earliest empire in Mesopotamia, in the 3rd millennium BC. You'll remember that the greatest ruler of the dynasty of Akkad in the ancient Near East was Naram-Sin. He used the tool of art to express his power and dominance over the lands he conquered. This approach to visual reinforcement of power and intimidation of enemies turned out to be a very successful strategy for ruling. And so much of the visual vocabulary of the ruler in the ancient Near East remained more or less the same in content, if not in style, for 3 millennia. The Assyrian reliefs, however, rather than using the single unified composition of one battle on a stela to make their point, go back to an older model. Early in Sumerian times, from the royal cemetery at Ur, we saw this depiction of battle in the Standard of Ur. In this piece, the battle unrolled in registers, and the narrative of different times and events could be told. Narrative art actually began here in Mesopotamia. More information and more of a story could be illustrated with this technique. And as you may remember, it recalled the unrolling of a cylinder seal, which as an art form was peculiar to and important to Mesopotamia. Here, you can see the chaos of war in both early and late relief carvings, one from Akkadian times, around 2250 BC, and the other from the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC. In the later Assyrian example, a more complex, chaotic scene of fallen enemies is often contrasted with orderly Assyrian troops, but the drama is similar in conception to the earlier stela. In these examples, you can see that this subject, war and victory with a rout of the enemy, is something of a delight to rulers. Assyrian rulers went to great pains to have a narrative of their conquests and individual battles rendered in stone for their palaces. In fact, small vignettes of particular cruelty or harsh treatment are common. This visual depiction of the enemy strikes us as similar in many ways to captives of war scenes in many other cultures. Here, for instance, is the famous Battle of Lachish, which is mentioned in the Bible. It was in Lachish that the earlier Assyrian king Sennacherib fought the Judeans in 701 BC. In his palace at Nineveh, in the northern part of Mesopotamia, he proudly displayed the scenes from the battle. The artist was careful to include the detail showing the impalement of enemy troops. This was a detail that they repeated in other palaces too. Indeed, they deliberately show scenes of enemy torture. That is very like the impetus behind Naram Sin's depiction of the routed enemy in his stela, and something we'll see as well in Egypt and in the Americas. Beheading of enemies was also depicted, almost with relish, and the heads were sometimes used to play catch. However, more seriously, you can see that the origin of our word head count comes from this. The scribes tried to accurately record the number of enemy killed from a pile of heads. The intimidation of the enemy and the glorification of the ruler in war were important visual propaganda to bolster the influence and power of any ruler. Images like this serve the purpose of deterring rebellion or war by showing brutal and ruthless treatment of enemies, and they recorded the martial accomplishments of the ruler. In fact, sometimes the depictions run completely counter to the truth. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, for instance, was shown as invincible in his art, but the Bible and the Greek historian Herodotus say otherwise about his battles. That tells us a lot about the role of the king in an empire. While the battle scenes of the Neo-Assyrian Empire tell us about history, at least as the Assyrian king wanted to tell it, there are other kinds of scenes. Those hark back to an earlier tradition and are more religious or ritual in nature. Those scenes give us some insight into Assyrian religious and ritual practices, and they show us different aspects of the role of the ruler. Among them are some of the greatest examples of ancient Near Eastern art, or any art. These are the famous scenes showing the lion hunt. Let's take a look. Here, you can see that the Assyrian king is engaged in a battle with lions, which he alternatively shoots with a bow and arrow, or spears, or stabs. Whatever he used, the end result is not so great for the lions. They always end up dead. And usually, their horrible end is aptly illustrated. The king proves in these hunts that he is greater in power than the noble beast. The lion represents not only a dangerous predator, but the forces of the wild and thus of chaos. The king conquers the forces of nature and has the stamina and capability to dominate an enemy, whether animal or human. The king's bold and courageous character is, in any case, emphasized here. But there's more to it than that. We'll examine these reliefs carefully and see how they sit squarely in the narrative tradition of Mesopotamia and the role of the king in the powers of the region. Let's look for a moment at the Uruk period, when the land between two rivers was an innovative place, a place that hatched the extraordinary inventions of stock breeding, farming, cities, writing, and art that communicated messages of a new social hierarchy. We're in the land of Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, about 3100 BC, and we see a new phenomenon, a ruler attempting to assert his dominance and justify his rule by means of art. Here's the example which prefigures our Assyrian lion hunts 2,000 years earlier, the lion hunt stela. As you can see, this is an eroded and unsophisticated stone carving depicting a man spearing a lion in the top section and one shooting an arrow at a lion below. There are two other lions pierced by arrows depicted in the field. The two men are in fact most likely the same person shown twice. People can recognize him as a priest king. We know this from his distinctive headgear or coiffure, beard, and skirt, which we saw in other examples of rulers from this and later periods. This theme of the lion hunt was represented many times over for 3 millennia in Mesopotamia, starting with this object. Why? It had resonance for the king and the populace. It showed a ruler doing what was expected of him, protecting his people from dangerous predators. Furthermore, on another level, it meant he was restoring order and repelling chaotic forces of the wild. Metaphorically, lions represented the destructive forces of nature. They were an actual foe, preying on the flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle. The Asiatic lion, Panthera leopersica, actually did range through the Near East until it was hunted to extinction there in the early 20th century. It was smaller than the African lion, but still a fierce predator. We know from sub-Saharan and Nilotic peoples that they had a tradition of killing a lion to prove bravery when entering manhood. This tradition supposedly existed in Mesopotamia well into modern times. It might well have contributed to the lion's extinction. Lions most certainly deserve their epithet of king of beasts. Unlike other predators, lions are not afraid and will stand their ground when challenged. This was interpreted as a sign of nobility and courage. They are, of course, extremely territorial, and their roar is feared and a chilling deterrent to foes. Therefore, the lion was not only a feared predator, but a noble competitor. Any foe who vanquished a lion was truly worthy. They were the king of beasts, and kings were their natural conquerors. Early cultures prized excellence in hunting for practical reasons, but the symbolic reasons were prized even more. Kings in most cultures have been associated with hunting, and the theme of the royal hunt is especially important in ancient Near Eastern art. Lions in this era were reserved for the royal hunt. In fact, the association of royalty with lion hunting led to this imagery being used even on the Assyrian royal seal. You can see in this earlier Assyrian depiction of a lion hunt from the reign of Ashur-nasir-pal II in Nimrud, 883 to 859 BC, that the king is in a chariot, shooting an arrow. One of the king's dead quarries fills the space beneath the galloping horse's feet. This is reminiscent of the standard of Ur, where you saw the dead enemy lying beneath the onager's feet. You can see that the artists used very realistic details to record the scene, including showing how the stallion's ears were laid back in their nervousness and fear of the lion. Note also that the textures of the lion's fur, the mane, and the clothes of the Assyrians are rendered in striking detail and with some great accuracy. In the much much earlier depiction from 3100 BC in the Uruk lion hunt stela, a priest king dramatically kills lions. He thrusts his spear diagonally and emphatically into the top lion, who is rearing up. And at the bottom, he seems to shoot another lion with an arrow, directly in the face at close range. The field is littered with lions. The ruler is triumphant. This is the first known example of a lion hunt in the ancient Near East. Now let's compare this to the much later scene of the famous Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. In two scenes here, he kills lions mano a mano. In this depiction of a lion hunt, Ashurbanipal, who dates 668 to 631 BC, is spearing a leaping lion in the mouth from his horse. Note that he has no stirrups. They weren't invented yet, which made riding all that much more difficult. Assyrians were excellent horsemen as well as ruthless warriors. The king wields his weapon assuredly. Note that the diagonal line created by the spear is continued into the lengthened body of the lion and reflects the lower leg of the horse. There's quite a bit of empty space around this scene, which is unlike most Assyrian reliefs. But this approach heightens the dramatic effect by isolating the most chilling moment. And you can note that details of dress, of harness, and of the animals are rendered impeccably and with great attention to the musculature and movement of animal and human. It's the same subject as the Uruk lion hunt stela, but with infinitely more sophistication and polish. Not that I don't like both of them a great deal. The other scene with Ashurbanipal shows the intimate and dramatic moment when the upright king delivers the coup de grace, a dagger in the chest of the still roaring and attacking lion. The king is calm and shows no fear. The lion has already got an arrow in his head. Violence in Assyria was a means to an end, and that end was order. Here is the king reinforcing that order. In the process of putting things right in the world, he also demonstrates almost superhuman bravery. The royal hunts glorify the king and show the boundless royal achievement. They were also religious in nature. How did they do it? Or did they actually do it? We can learn a lot about that if we look at the entire scene of 3 registers of lion hunt now in the British Museum. These read as a narrative in registers, much like the Standard of Ur from 2 millennia before. The action reads from the right to the left, top to bottom. As with most narrative Assyrian reliefs of this era, the top registers are action scenes, whereas the bottom scene is a culminating scene, one which shows the result of the action. So what's actually going on? Here at the top right is a lion being released from a cage. The door of the cage is being pulled up by a boy who's sequestered in his own protective cage. This tells us that the lion was brought from elsewhere. In fact, the action is believed to have been taking place in an arena, not on the steps. The next moment, to the left, we are to understand that the lion is galloping forward toward the king. In the last moment, the lion leaps up in the air to confront the king, but he is too late. The king has triumphed in this exciting scene. On the middle register, we see another arena scene. A man on horseback seems to be provoking a rather inactive lion lying on the ground. To his left, the king, we think, has resorted to his own provocation of the lion. Incredibly, he grabs it and twists it by the tail. Next, the lion seems to jump up and remonstrate. On the diagonal, he's now truly annoyed, and he shows it. At the bottom, we have the religious rite, which concludes the lion hunt. From this scene, you can see that this is not a sport alone. It has much more import than that. The king, Ashurbanipal, is shown here in his formal characteristic hat, pouring libations of wine from a cup over the bodies of 4 dead lions. Behind him are his courtiers and horses. In front is an altar with offerings of food and another with incense. Musicians play a stringed instrument as Ashurbanipal dedicates his hunting bow to the goddess Ishtar, according to the caption. Other reliefs show more lion hunts and dramatic confrontations of king and animal. Sometimes Ashurbanipal is in his chariot. In others, he hunts on horseback or on foot. The king is the master of bow, spear, and dagger. But the king is impassive, and compared to the lions, not as interesting or as much of the focus as these dramatically dying beasts. Here are some examples of lions that have been dispatched by the hunter. They're quite varied in their expressions of agony and suffering, and their positions are closely observed. It seems as if the artists have been good observers of the beast and want to impart a meticulously lifelike and impressive record of the emotional and physical suffering of the animal. The 2 most famous reliefs of lions near death are these. They are the most wrenching. The animals are in an agony of pain. The lioness, dying, clearly tries to drag herself to safety as the life seeps out of her back legs. She roars in pain, but to no avail. The dying lion, an acclaimed masterpiece, vomits blood as he clenches his claws and feet in the last gasps of life. The arrow has hit him in the shoulder, and his rear legs have collapsed beneath him. His veins stand out on his face. One can hardly look at this today without feeling the cruelty and ruthlessness of the hunter as an assault on a sensitive creature. However, that is probably not how the Assyrians or other ancient peoples would have viewed it. They knew lions as dangerous and noble animals, and they were genuinely threatened by them. They might, according to some suggestions, have thought this was humorous, or more likely, in my opinion, they thought more highly of their king, whose bravery bested these beasts. All in all, the lion hunt showed the most artistic skill ever in the Assyrian court, and also demonstrated that the king restored order to the world. The chaotic and destructive world of wild steppes, of nature unleashed, had to be kept at bay by the divine forces of the king, mighty king of Assyria and ruler of the 4 quarters, ruler of the universe. That's from the standard inscription. We will see more lions in our next stop at the gates of Babylon.